Good morning and welcome. This is 10 Years Hence. My name is James O'Rourke. I'm a professor of management and former director of the Fanning Center for Business Communication. I'll be your instructor and host for this lecture series. We've arranged a series of 7 lectures for you that I think you'll find both interesting and exciting. Our aim is to engage in some structured speculation about the future, specifically the decade just ahead and the world we're likely to inhabit 10 years from now. We'll do that from a number of perspectives, but all of it will be focused on one central theme: life beyond Earth. Our speakers come to us from many parts of the nation and all walks of life. Christian Davenport is a reporter covering NASA and the space industry for the Washington Post. We'll meet him in a moment. Colonel Eileen Collins is a retired United States Air Force officer, a former NASA astronaut, and a U.S. Air Force test pilot. Lieutenant General William LeCoury is Deputy Chief of Staff for Space Operations, Strategy, Plans, Programs, Requirements, and Analysis for the United States Space Force. Eric Thomas is a mission manager for New Shepard at Blue Origin, a privately funded aerospace manufacturer and suborbital spaceflight services company headquartered in Kent, Washington. Bob Jedicke is a professor of astronomy at the University of Hawaii, an expert on the commercial value of the asteroid belt in this solar system. Marina Brozovic is a scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and California Institute of Technology. She is widely acknowledged as one of the leading experts on the dangers posed by asteroids and other near-Earth objects. And finally, Benjamin Bainey is a senior fellow at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he studies strategic competition in the 21st century in the areas of space, cyber, and advanced science and technology. That's a pretty good group. We'll gather here on 7 separate Fridays during spring semester. We'll begin promptly at 10:40 each morning, concluding about noon. In order to make this a productive, useful experience for all, I have a few requests of those of you in the room. First, for our alumni, friends, and associates joining us through ThinkND, welcome. Please plan to log on to our scheduled lecture dates before 10:40 a.m. We'll begin promptly at 10:40, and I'd like you to be online by then. For all students and guests, please review a copy of the syllabus and make a note of the dates on which we will gather here. If you're enrolled in the course, I've emailed you a PDF of that document, which you will also find on the Canvas learning platform. If anyone else would like a copy of the syllabus, send me an email at jo'rourke@nd.edu. I'll get one to you. If you're enrolled in this course for academic credit, you will be required to attend all scheduled lectures. I will handle exceptions to this rule personally. Even if an absence is approved, excused, and documented, you will need to make up the work by summarizing the lecture following viewing on digital video, or see another lecture on campus. Check with me for details. And if you're enrolled for credit, you'll be required to produce an original research paper on a subject related to our theme. It's a brief paper, but I think you'll find the task interesting. On the Canvas platform, you will find nearly 24 articles from popular and scientific press on subjects directly related to our chosen theme. I ask that you read at least one of those articles a week. They are pretty short reads, and use their content to help formulate a plan for your research paper. Again, if you have questions or concerns, read the syllabus. If you still have questions, check with me. Finally, for those here in Jordan Auditorium, I am asking that you switch off your mobile phones, laptop computers, iPads, and other electronic devices. Unless you are a journalist reporting on this event, I ask that you do that now. Thank you. I think you'll find nothing in your email inbox, your text messages, or a Google search box that is more important than what our speakers will have to say. Please expect to hear from me personally if I find that you have difficulty complying with this. When our speaker concludes his remarks today, we'll offer you an opportunity to participate by asking questions. We will have microphones so that you can be properly heard and so that your questions will be recorded and available on the Panopto tab on Canvas. Last note, I'm wearing a mask today. I'm not a completely happy camper in that regard. I'd rather not. I made an appeal to the highest ranking authority I thought would take me seriously, and the answer was, we're wearing masks, Jim. So there it is. For now, we're wearing masks. I thank you for wearing yours and doing so properly. Our speaker today is Christian Davenport, a staff writer at the Washington Post covering space for the financial desk. He joined the Post in 2000 and was on a team that won the Peabody Award in 2010 for its work on veterans with traumatic brain injury. He has also been on reporting teams that were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize 3 times. Davenport is the author of 2 books, Space Barons, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and the Quest to Colonize the Cosmos, and As You Were, to War and Back with the Black Hawk Battalion of the Virginia National Guard. He's a frequent commentator on television and radio and was producer of Space, the Private Frontier, a 2-hour documentary that aired on the Discovery and Science channels, and a producer and co-host of Space Launch Live, the network's live broadcast of SpaceX's first crewed missions, winning an Emmy Award in 2001. Mr. Davenport has also served as a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and he is a graduate of Colby College in Maine. He lives in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the Notre Dame campus, Christian Davenport.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for you inviting me and for the school for having me. So I write about space for the Washington Post, but here's the thing. I didn't grow up a space fan. I mean, I grew up like a Star Wars fan, didn't really like Star Trek, but it just wasn't an inspiring time. I mean, I was born in 1973. You'll hear people of, the generation above me rhapsodize about, where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon and where they were and witnessing all of that. I didn't have that. In fact, my first memory of space was being homesick. I think it was the 7th grade, and watching some, dumb game show, and the news breaking in, and that Space Shuttle Challenger had exploded. And I sat there on my couch that whole day watching the images go over. And if you've ever seen that, it's just a massive fireball. And that was the image of space that I grew up with. I didn't, the space shuttle is an extraordinary vehicle. After a lot of work to get it up and running, it was reusable. It could land on a runway as opposed to a capsule landing at sea. But at least for me, and I think a lot of people in my generation, I never had that connection to space that I think people did in Apollo. But the thing about shuttle was it held this promise. I mean, particularly in the early days. It was called shuttle for a reason, that it was going to be like the airplane it resembled. It was going to fly frequently. Some people thought it would fly 40, 50, 60 times a year. The space shuttle would fly so frequently that, of course, NASA, it would exhaust its own professionally trained astronauts, and they would fly private citizens. And they had actually a NASA-sanctioned program called the Spaceflight Participant Program, and they went out and they said, who should we fly? What civilians? What ordinary people? And they decided first on a teacher. Next was going to be a journalist. The journalist, I think, wanted to go first, but too bad. then maybe they were thinking about an artist. And so it was the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, who was on that shuttle. And in 1986, when it exploded, and she died along with 6 other NASA astronauts. And for all intents and purposes, that ended the spaceflight participant program. The journalist never flew, even though at that time NASA had narrowed down, I think it was something like 3,500 applicants, reporters who had applied, down to 40. I think most people's money was on Walter Cronkite was going to go, from CBS News, who famously narrated the Apollo 11 moon landing. But that never happened. And the shuttle had a great 30-year run. It flew 135 times, but at least for me, it didn't capture my imagination. And so where I sort of had my space awakening, and it was more of a professional interest, comes not until about 2014. And at this time, the space shuttle had retired. And it was retired in 2011. And I don't even think at the time I was quite aware of this. But when the space shuttle went away, the United States government had no way to fly astronauts. We couldn't do it. The cruel irony is we were paying Russia to fly American astronauts to the International Space Station. And the Russians kind of figured this out. They said, at first, the price, they would have an exchange of astronauts. But then they started charging, I think it was $20 or $30 million a seat, and the training and all of that. And it got up to the point where they understood supply and demand. They were charging $85 million a seat to fly our astronauts. Which is, just think of the irony, that the United States beats the Soviet Union to the moon, and now Russia's flying our astronauts. So this is where I sort of come into it, and I get assigned to cover a press conference in 2014. And it was some guy named Elon Musk was holding a press conference in Washington at the National Press Club because his company, which I had kind of heard of a little bit, SpaceX, was suing the United States Air Force. This tells you a little bit about something about Elon, because he was suing the Air Force and the Pentagon because he wanted to work for them, which is sort of I don't know how you go about going and get customers, but I normally don't sue them. But he did, and he filed a lawsuit because he wanted to be able to compete and get the contract from the Air Force to fly national security satellites on his rocket. And that work, essentially there was a monopoly. There was one company that was flying national security satellites called the United Launch Alliance, which is this joint venture between Boeing and Lockheed Martin. So you talk about the military-industrial complex, that's who he's going up against, and that's the industry he's trying to disrupt. And nobody's heard of SpaceX. Boeing, Lockheed, they had been contractors for NASA for decades, going back through parent companies to the dawn of the space age. I don't think anybody took Elon or SpaceX seriously at this time, but he started pounding away at that. And one of the things he kept pointing out, and I'm starting to pay attention, because I'm like, who is this guy, Elon? And he starts off the press conference not talking about the lawsuit. He talks about something, and I at the time I was like, I don't know what he's talking about, but he was talking about a soft water landing, where they launched the rocket and they were bringing it back to Earth, and it was hovering over the water at a precise spot, and then it would fall into the water. And I'm like, and he spent a good amount of time, and I could see all the other, I was doing more defense at the time, but I could see all the other space reporters really key into this. I'm like, what are they talking about? But what they were talking about was the way, a complete change in the way rockets operate. And that is that first stage launches, it carries the second stage, or the payload and the satellites or the capsule into orbit, and then that first stage plops into the ocean and gets thrown away. That's the way we did it for the Saturn V. That rocket during Apollo was thrown away in the ocean. And Elon and others are looking at it and saying, that's crazy. That's insane. I mean, imagine flying from South Bend to Washington, D.C., as I did, and you threw away the airplane after the flight. After every flight, you threw away the airplane. That would just make flying prohibitively expensive. So what they're trying to do is say, no, we want to recover the booster, because the booster, that first stage, that's where your costs are for the most part. That's the most powerful part of the rocket. That's where the engines are. I mean, that big tube you see of a rocket, that's just a canister for fuel. That's all it is. But the engines at the bottom, that's where your costs are. So he was trying to look at a way to bring all of that back. So anyway, I leave this press conference and I start researching that, and I start thinking like, man, there's something going on here with this commercial space industry. And I know, Jeff Bezos has a space company, and Elon Musk and Richard Branson, and one of the main tenets in journalism is to follow the money. And it occurred to me that if the richest men in the world, or some of them, are plowing big parts of their fortunes into space and trying to develop new technologies and new ways of doing things, maybe that's something we should be paying attention to, because frankly, a lot of the mainstream media was not paying attention to that at that time. Now it's a big deal, and reporters who cover it get invited to speak at lectures like this. But at the time, nobody was paying attention to that because it was unclear whether it could work. Going into space, one of the things they say, you want to start a space company, the quickest way to become a millionaire in space is to start out as a billionaire. You're going to lose your shirt. Elon thought he was going to lose his shirt. He thought SpaceX maybe 20, 30, 40% chance of succeeding, of taking on Lockheed Martin and Boeing, building a rocket from private capital, doing it on his own. He didn't think any of this was going to work. But I was sort of curious and seeing, that there was enough there to be able to do that. And right around this time, a whole bunch of things started happening. And one of them was that SpaceX and Boeing win the contract from NASA, it's called the Commercial Crew Program, to fly NASA's astronauts, to finally end the reliance on the Russian Soyuz. So SpaceX and another company had been flying cargo and supplies and experiments to the International Space Station, sort of as a delivery service, sort of an Uber Eats for the ISS. But at the time, when that contract was awarded, there was great hesitancy, and maybe even more than great hesitancy, for people to let the private sector, the commercial sector, fly NASA's most precious resources. Its astronauts, no way. But then in 2014, that's when SpaceX and Boeing win that contract. And then you start seeing the rocket landings a year later in 2015. And we didn't hear, as a reporter, much about Jeff Bezos' company. We knew about Amazon, and yes, he owns the Washington Post, and we cover him like anybody else. But nobody at that time had really heard of Blue Origin, and yet, this is really what he is most passionate about, space. And he's said that since. He didn't say it then. And we get this phone call. I got a phone call at like 5:30 in the morning. Wake up. And I ignored it because I didn't recognize the number, and they kept calling. And finally I woke up and they said, we have news. You're going to interview Jeff Bezos. Your time slot is 9 o'clock, and we have news. And the news was, if I can play it, that they had flown a booster. There we go. This is a suborbital booster, so it goes up and comes straight back down, and it reached space and then came back down, and this was the first time that Blue Origin had ever done that, and this is what it looked like.
Estimate 30 seconds to engine start. $25,000 feet. Drag brakes are open. $13,000 feet AGL. Estimate 10 seconds to engine start. Engine start, we have thrust. 2,000 feet. 1,000 feet. 500 feet. Fuel coming out. 150 feet. Negative 7 feet per second. Fuel deployed. 70 feet. 50 feet. Velocity steady. Touchdown.
I love that guy in the front row with the long hair. He just goes insane. So that's a big moment for them because, you know, they're going to brought it back and they're going to fly that thing again. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, you saw the engine has to relight. There's a pad it has to land on. Actually, in one of them, you can see that the booster realizes it's not dead center. And so it, at the last second, kind of scooches over, and they realize they can ease the algorithm that they don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good enough. Just make sure it's on the pad. And Jeff tweets after that on his Twitter account, he says, "The rarest of beasts, a used rocket." And this pisses Elon off in a big way. Because first, it's a suborbital rocket. If you look at it, it would fit right here. I mean, it's not that big. I mean, as a rocket goes. Elon's trying to do this, but from orbit, right? So if you're going to orbit, you know, the International Space Station is traveling 17,500 miles an hour, essentially in this continuous free fall around Earth. That's how fast it's traveling. So to put something into orbit and then bring it back is a whole different ballgame. And they had been practicing this on you know, boosters that would go up and hover and then come back down. So he was enormously pissed off that that Jeff Bezos was making a big deal of this. And so what you're seeing here, and I wrote this book called The Space Barons, but they're business people, right? They're entrepreneurs and they're competing. And they're competing in a very public way. And sometimes they get personal, or at least Elon does with Jeff. And you have businesses competing in a way that it used to be governments. It used to be the United States and the Soviet Union. Now there's some talk about a renewed space race, perhaps with China. But you're seeing a shift in the paradigm here. And since we're at a business school, I sort of wanted to highlight that the businesses are taking the roles of superpower. Businesses, I should say, backed by enormous amount of capital by their owners or by the government, but businesses still. So I had been watching, SpaceX had been trying to land a booster, and it was right before Christmas in 2015, and I just had this feeling that Elon was going to do it. That they were coming so close, and at the time, Donald Trump is sort of coming back or emerging as a force in the presidential election. And I go to my editor and I say, I got to go see this. I think they're going to stick the landing on this next launch right before Christmas. And he says, yeah, here's the thing, Chris. Our travel budget is just blown. It's just completely blown because of the election, and we just don't have the money, and it's at the end of the year, we don't have anything. And the launch kept getting delayed, and I couldn't help it. So I went to another boss and I said, hey, it was on Sunday afternoon. I said, I think I should head down for this. And he said, not knowing that the other boss had said no, he said, go ahead. And I said, great. And so I'm down in Cape Canaveral on Monday for the launch, and the boss, my editor, says, well, Chris is down at the Cape for the thing. And I guess the business editor kind of hit the roof because he said, no, we told him not to, but sometimes you've got to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And what I saw was, I think, pretty extraordinary. And I was excited to be there to see more crazy rocket people cheering and going nuts. Oh, there's no.
That is a view from the landing pad.
That is that first stage coming
back.
back down to land at Cape Canaveral. History in the making, guys.
Stage one is landing. LZ-1, the Falcon is landed. Landing operators moving to procedure 11.100, section 3 on LZ-1 VNet and recovery net. Repeat, the Falcon
the next day, all of the Cape Canaveral was like completely shut down. The media site was shut down where you normally go, just because, I mean, this thing, if it, it could land in downtown Titusville, and it's like a bomb going off. So they kept us separated. But the next morning, SpaceX chartered a boat, and we got to go out and see it. So I think the advent of the reusable rocket, from a business case, at least from the company's point of view, think this is a way that's going to lower the cost of access to space in a way that they really try to disrupt the industry. And while what I showed you is everyone cheering and all of the success, I wanted to show just one more quick video that I think illustrates how difficult this actually is. And SpaceX kind of poked fun at themselves with some of their... That's pretty cool. So I'm following that as a reporter, and I'm thinking, yeah, this is, oh, we could just leave that, and I'll take it out, so I think I'm done. This transcends what I'm doing in my day-to-day job. I mean, there's something bigger here that, I can't just cover as a newspaper reporter. I started thinking what we're seeing is sort of perhaps the next chapter in space exploration, or human space exploration, right? In the early days, you had Mercury and Gemini and Apollo, and then Space Shuttle and the International Space Station, and now there's sort of this commercial space age. And I thought that's what we're beginning to see. I didn't know if it would succeed or fail, but I decided I wanted to go out and chronicle that, and that's why I took leave from the Post to write the book that gets at the visions of the space barons, as I call them, in the early days. So I thought I might take a minute just to talk a little bit about what their visions are and what they want to accomplish. And in some ways, as I said earlier, it's very similar. What Musk and Bezos want is to lower the cost of accessing space to enable new technologies that will make it more efficient, you fly more reliably, and just do it over and over again and bring the costs down. I mean, there's a reason why space was the exclusive domain of governments for decades. It's because the cost of entry was just too high. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. And so they wanted to change that. But their long-term goals are actually quite different. And and they're kind of insane if you think about it. It's it lets you into their brain a little bit to think this is what these guys are thinking about, because they're big thoughts that maybe take a minute to get your head around. But Elon, is concerned in around 1999, 2000, thereabouts, about a backup for humanity. Like, what happens if an asteroid hits Earth and humanity becomes extinct and we go the way of the dinosaurs? And this is what's worrying him, apparently. Kind of a dark thought to have, and not that he thinks this is going to happen, in his lifetime or his great-grandchildren's lifetimes, but at some point it could happen. And where are we in getting to Mars? Because in his mind, Mars is, it's awful, but we could probably maybe live there. It's close enough. Has some sort of no, you can't like breathe the air or anything like that, but you could set up a city there and have a backup for humanity, right? I mean, my computer crashed. Hopefully I've got stuff in the cloud. I've got a backup for it, but humanity has no backup. So he's thinking about, we need to get to Mars. Jeff's philosophy is sort of, in some ways, the opposite of that. That, instead of this, as he says, plan B should be to make sure plan A works, right? Plan A being Earth, because Earth it's pretty nice. I mean, it's a cold day today out in South Bend, but the snow is picturesque. I had a nice dinner and a glass of wine last night. We have bacon, and we have waterfalls and palm trees and college football, and Earth is okay. Like, Earth is, something we should probably try to preserve. But his concern is that our population is growing, our demand for resources is growing. The resources on Earth are finite. And if we want to keep using all of those goods we buy on Amazon, that we're going to need to go out into space to get those resources. And building the architecture that then takes you out to asteroids. And Professor O'Rourke was talking about, I guess you're going to have someone come and talk about asteroid mining and getting precious metals, or having solar arrays in space where you get solar power 24/7, without night and day and without interference from the atmosphere. And so he's thinking about building these sort of huge, massive colonies in space, and what he calls a great inversion, and taking all of the heavy, polluting industry that we do now on Earth and moving that into space and preserving Earth. And he gives a speech about it today, and he gives it every once in a while. And what Jeff says is, today he uses this line, Earth should be zoned, residential. And space should be zoned, that's industrial. Well, if you want to understand like what Jeff Bezos thinks about space, he's been giving that speech since he was in high school. And in fact, he gave a version of that speech when he was a valedictorian at his high school in Florida, only he didn't use the Earth should be zoned residential line. He said Earth should be preserved as a national park. So he's been talking about this his whole life. I mean, he didn't grow up dreaming one day of selling books on the internet, but he did dream about going to space. That was his passion. I mean, he talks about being 5 years old and watching astronauts walk on the moon. That sort of imprinted space on his, just became his ultimate passion. And there's a chapter in the book, I mean, you talk about the crazy things these guys do. In 2013, this is what you do when you have a lot of money, I guess. Jeff chartered a mission to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and to find the rocket engines that were used on the Saturn V for Apollo 11 that took the astronauts to the moon, right? Because those engines from that rocket got discarded in the ocean, and he wanted to go find them. I mean, it's a hunk of metal, right? I mean, and it's really hot, and then it hits the ocean. It's going to be all twisted and torn. I mean, who cares? Like, Jeff, just leave it, man. But he cares about it. He wanted to go get it. And it's not like finding like the Titanic, which is huge. I mean, these are big rocket engines, but in the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, it's hard to find. And anyway, so that gives you a sense of like where he's coming from. And now, as he says, space is the most important thing he's doing. He's spending $1 billion a year of his own money into it and trying to build that access to space. He'll say, from a business standpoint, when he founded Amazon, right, the tools for that business to succeed were there, right? The telephone companies had laid down the cable lines for the internet. The post office was there to deliver the books for him. There was this invention called the credit card where he could take everybody's money to buy those books and the services. That infrastructure was there. You know, you could have a Mark Zuckerberg start Facebook in his dorm room because that business infrastructure was all there. The infrastructure for a space business isn't really there. It's still too expensive. And so he talks about wanting to build the infrastructure so that some kid could start a space company perhaps in their dorm room and have that, you know, easy, reliable access to space. And in his mind, and I don't know if this is going to work out or is true, and I certainly, you know, don't endorse this. I'm just sort of explaining his sort of ethos in all of this, is that in space there could be a kind of economic dynamism that creates whole new markets that's similar to what the internet did. Which, you know, I think from a business standpoint is really interesting, and a lot of people are trying to make that happen. Okay, so where we are now. I mean, I've been talking a lot about the past, but it's a really interesting time. And I'm back to doing my day job, and it's really busy. Let's see how much time we have. I mean, it's the past few years it's just insane, and now the interest is really coming along. So you've had, for example, SpaceX is flying astronauts to the International Space Station. They've done it a few times. They're doing it, you know, successfully. I don't know that's human spaceflight. You don't ever want to call it routine. It's still very dangerous. But we're no longer reliant on the Russians. So that program, it took longer. There were a lot of setbacks, but they're doing it. Interestingly, remember I was talking about the two companies that won that commercial crew contract to fly astronauts? The other company, Boeing, the one everyone thought would fly first, is not flying astronauts still. They still are having all sorts of problems. And if you had told people that SpaceX was going to beat Boeing to space flying astronauts when they won the contract in 2014, people would have laughed at you. But Boeing, in their first, they did a test flight, an uncrewed test flight, a test flight without astronauts. These are autonomous spacecraft, just to see if it would work. In December 2019, they had all kinds of software problems, and they had to end the mission early and bring the capsule back. It took, all the way until last summer, and they were going to finally, they said, we got it fixed. We're going to try again. They have the spacecraft on top of the rocket, and they realize in the service module, some of the valves are stuck, and they can't get them unstuck. And so they have a hardware problem. So now they bring it back, and they're going in, which shows, SpaceX is good, and Boeing is good, but this is really, really hard stuff. So we're hoping that SpaceX is going to fly, or Boeing is going to fly soon. You also have, in terms of human spaceflight, one of the things that's going on, you've probably seen these suborbital space tourism flights, right? Like Richard Branson went, and Jeff Bezos went. He took his brother. It was really funny. I mean, talk about the rivalries. Jeff had announced that he was going to fly, I think it was July 20th on the anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, and Richard Branson didn't want to get beat, so he moved his flight up and basically jumped the line and got on an earlier test flight so he would fly before Jeff. And I remember I asked him about that. I said, come on, Richard, you're doing this just to beat Jeff. This is a competition. And he says, in his British accent, oh, no, Chris, it's just a lovely coincidence, which of course was not true. He was doing it to troll Jeff. And actually, as it turned out, I was in Seattle at Blue Origin's headquarters, and they were not pleased about that, I can tell you. But that was kind of cool. And then, Jeff has done it since. They flew Captain Kirk, if you saw. They flew Michael Strahan, and they're kind of getting all of this press. And with it, too, I'm going to talk a minute about the space tourism, because I think it's really interesting. And if the company's goals are to open up space to the masses, to make it more accessible, really, at least for now, who they're opening up to is people who are very wealthy or a celebrity. Blue Origin auctioned off a seat for its first flight, and the auction went to $28 million, which is a ridiculous amount of money to pay for a suborbital space flight that from start to finish, from the launch of the rocket and the capsule separates and is in space for about 4 minutes, maybe closer to 3, and you unstrap and you float around, and yes, you get great views of the Earth, and then you come back down. That's 10 minutes. And this guy is, going to pay $28 million. They're selling some of these other seats. They don't disclose, but you have to guess it's in the millions of dollar ranges. Virgin Galactic is going to charge $500,000 for their suborbital space tourism flights. If you want to go to the International Space Station, we know there's a company that's taking people there called Axiom Space. First trips are $55 million if you want to spend a week on the International Space Station. So it sounds like we're not there yet. But if you look at new technologies, right, and flying in the early days of commercial aviation, it was very expensive. Not everybody could do it. This is what the companies say. They hope the costs will come down. I think there's another interesting aspect of it. There's only been about 600 people or so who've ever been to space. And if you've ever talked to an astronaut, and you'll have one here next and coming up in the lecture series, they'll talk about seeing Earth from a distance and seeing the curvature of the Earth and the thin line of the atmosphere and the dark, black, inky vastness of space, and realizing that this pale blue dot, that we're in space. I mean, we're just in orbit around the sun. And you see, how bright and blue and beautiful the Earth is, and land masses there are no borders. There's no Ukraine and Russia from space. It's just this big landmass, and the transformative effect that has. I mean, if you look at the birth of Earth Day, right? A lot of that came from that image, taken from space, of the pale blue dot of Earth, the whole Earth, just hanging suspended out there, that has had a transformative effect on society. So imagine, and we'll take the optimistic view, that these companies are successful. And just to back up a minute, let's not forget that Virgin Galactic had a fatal crash in 2014 that killed one of the co-pilots, and everything has an asterisk in human spaceflight, that it is exceedingly dangerous still. No matter how much the SpaceX fans and the Blue Origin fans are jumping up and down and high-fiving each other like they're at a college football game. It is very, very difficult. But let's take the moment to say they're able to do this. And you go from 600 people who've been to space to 6,000 to 60,000 over a series of years. And now, we're talking about the 10 years hence and what that means, where, someone who knows someone who's been to space and can talk about that. And to bring that perspective back, I think that could be, really transformative. And so we're seeing today the beginning of that tourism market perhaps starting to open. Again, I say perhaps. If there's a fatal crash, what happens? Does the government come in and shut it down? Does it need to be more tightly regulated? There's actually a discussion about that right now, because the way suborbital space tourism works, it's like going skydiving or bungee jumping. You sign a paper that says, the chances are high that you may get hurt or die, and you're able to go. I mean, the FAA will let you go. So that, I think that people discount it, but I want to take a minute to talk about that. The other thing that's going on, and here I am talking about the commercial space industry and how it's growing, but let's not discount NASA, right? Don't forget about NASA, because what NASA just did last year was put a rover on the surface of Mars again. Not just a rover but they put, it's called a helicopter, but it's basically a little drone that's flying in the Martian atmosphere. I mean, that is incredible. And that's not something any company is going to be able to do on its own. They just launched the James Webb Space Telescope, too, that's going to look back at some of the earliest light at the formation of the solar system, which will be really fascinating. And all of that is going to be transformative. But what you're seeing at NASA now is a paradigm shift where, yes, they're going off and doing the big things as a government should. If you look at NASA's budget, what is it, 23, 24 billion, somewhere in there. The Department of Defense has something like closer to, I think, 800 billion. So it's relatively small agency. And so what they're trying to do is leverage this commercial space industry, the industry that it once looked at very skeptically and said, you're not going to fly our astronauts. You're not going to do all of that. But now they're adopting that model of the public-private partnership where they outsource first flying cargo and supplies to the International Space Station, then flying astronauts. Now they're looking at the private industry for two other major programs. Maybe first I'll talk about the International Space Station. International Space Station has been up there for more than 20 years. It's in orbit around us right now. I actually encourage you, if you go on NASA's website, it'll tell you when the International Space Station, you put in your location, when it's going to fly overhead, and you go out and look at it. It's pretty awesome. It's this bright light. I mean, it looks brighter than any other star, and it goes whizzing right by it because it orbits the Earth every 90 minutes, but it's getting old. And the White House just announced plans. They want to extend it to 2030. But, you know, things break, you know, like the toilet breaks. It has cracks. It had a leak where they couldn't find where the leak was. So these Russian cosmonauts actually opened up a tea bag to see where the tea leaves went. And they did, you know, because they're floating in space, and they found where the hole was. So it's not going to be up there forever. But NASA, you know, spent $100 billion on it. They're not going to go out and build another space station. So they're looking to the private sector to do that. So not only provide transportation to low Earth orbit, but to provide the destination. And so Blue Origin is bidding on that, Nanoracks and Lockheed Martin. So you have commercial space stations as well, which is a pretty cool thing to think about. A company called Axiom Space. And a difference between a commercial space station, right? It's not just the sort of function. I mean, these, in some cases, they talk about luxurious feel. It'll feel more like a hotel than just, you know, the cluttered International Space Station. The other thing is that's sort of big for NASA right now is the Artemis program. And Artemis was a twin sister of Apollo, and NASA wants to go back to the moon. And as they'll say, this time to stay. And a lot of people say, well, we've been to the moon. In fact, President Obama, and talking about his vision for space and where we should go, literally said, you know, the moon, we've been there, done that. We should go to Mars. And one of the reasons why, frankly, we haven't been anywhere but low Earth orbit is not because of NASA. It's because of different administrations. It's because of Congress. Because you'll have one president come in and say, we want to go back to the moon. Another one say, no, we want to go to Mars. And then, no, we're going back to the moon. And so that's what the Trump administration said in 2024. We're going to the moon. We're going to go to stay. There is, as we know now, there is water on the moon. We're not going, in Apollo, we went to the equatorial regions. This time when we go back, we're going to go to the lunar South Pole where there's water. Water is nice to have. If you're a human being, we all need water. Water is also rocket fuel. It can be used as rocket fuel. At least that's the theory, that they could take it, break the hydrogen, the oxygen apart, and then use the moon as a gas station to go to space. And of course, there are a lot of science that we can do there as well. And there are a lot of people more adept at speaking that than I, but it's I think, a fascinating time to go back to the moon. But again, what NASA is looking at is they've got their big rocket. that's going to fly this, what's called the Orion capsule, into orbit around the moon. But the Orion capsule can't land on the moon. So NASA needs a lunar lander. So they're looking, again, to this commercial space industry and bidding that out. And at this time, for the Commercial Crew Program, everyone thought Boeing was going to win. On the lunar lander contract, everyone thought that Blue Origin, that's Jeff Bezos' company, was going to win. They had teamed up with Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Draper. I mean, you got they called it the national team, right? All-star cast. Again, bringing the military-industrial complex, mixing that with Blue Origin, which is the commercial company, sort of old space and new space, bringing that together. There was a first round of contracts that NASA put out, and Blue Origin and the national team kind of cleaned up. They won more money than anyone else. They thought they were a shoo-in to win that. And then the contract broke, and I broke the story for the Washington Post, and I was on vacation, and I was that in fact Blue Origin did not win, but SpaceX won. And it was one of those where I almost had like a panic attack because I'm like, I can't believe it. I can't believe that SpaceX won this. This is going to be wrong. It's going to be like a Dewey defeats Truman headline. So actually before I posted it, even though I had multiple sources, I made somebody send me the document, and SpaceX won, at least for this one mission on this, what they're building a rocket called Starship. And they're doing this in South Texas that would be able to dock with the Orion spacecraft and bring the astronauts down to the surface of the moon. And what they're doing now sort of repeats some of the videos where they were trying to land the Starship rocket. And it kept blowing up and blowing up. And maybe they'll have another blooper reel just for Starship. But it's sort of fascinating. It flies up, then does like a belly flop, and it falls back through the atmosphere, and it's got these little wings that help, keep it stable and steer it. And right at the last second, it flips over and lands, and they were able to do that. So initially, when Trump announced the Artemis program, he said, we need to have a sense of urgency. Like NASA, we haven't been back to the moon in 1972. We need to move. So in a speech, former Vice President Pence said, we're going to do it. We're going to be there by 2024, which of course everyone thought was political because it aligned with the political election schedule. And they said, no, we've got to have a sense of urgency. We've got to light a fire under NASA, under the contractors to be able to do it and to move fast. Trump, of course, lost. You have a new administration come in, and something remarkable happened. And it was remarkable, and as a Washington Post reporter, this is something I was sort of wondering. Because as the Biden administration comes in, first thing they do is lay waste to all of the programs, all of the scaffolding that the Trump administration put up. They did everything they could to sort of stamp all of that out, except for what was going on at NASA. The Artemis program stayed. They doubled down on it, and they doubled down on the number of programs, which was fast. So now you've got continuity. And they've looked at it and they said, well, 2024 we're not going to make that because things were just not ready. So they're looking at 2025 for return. We'll see if that happens. The big rocket that NASA owns, called the Space Launch System, is down at the Kennedy Space Center. They're going to roll it out perhaps next month to the pad and do a fueling test. So, it looks like this may actually happen. Elon is saying that Starship is going to be able to launch to orbit this year if you can get the permits. So you've got those two, SLS Orion, Starship. You've got SpaceX with the Dragon spacecraft that flies astronauts. Boeing and Starliner, if they get up and running, that will be another vehicle that can take people to space. And you've got Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2, and Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket that would also take humans. So we went from the space shuttle to nothing to all of these options, which is actually sort of an extraordinary thing that people don't quite realize, that now there's not just one option, but many. And the fascinating thing too, and then maybe I'll go to questions just in a little bit, is on that lunar lander concept or contract that Bezos thought he was going to win and was certain of it, you see a reprise of the competition and the battling between Blue Origin and SpaceX, between Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Because Blue Origin and Jeff, they were so shocked they didn't win that contract for the lunar lander. They filed a protest, which you can do on a government procurement program. You take it to the Government Accountability Office, and they lost. They then sued at the Court of Federal Claims and said, NASA erred in the awarding of this contract. It shouldn't, here are the many reasons why it shouldn't go to SpaceX, it should come to us. And they lost there too. But again, what this shows you is you've got multiple providers working in concert sort of against each other. And SpaceX knows that Jeff's not going to give up. And there's a guy who's crazy enough to go pluck those engines from the bottom of the ocean in 2013. He wants to go to the moon. He's going to keep fighting. So Elon knows that he's going to have Jeff on his tails. And in fact, you know, Elon has said this, and I've talked to him, and I think he's sincere. I think he actually wants Blue Origin to succeed. I think he wants more people in there. He wants the competition. In fact, he kind of taunts Jeff and says, you know, you should spend less time on Amazon and less time, you know, flying around and doing all the things you're doing. You should be focused more on space. Because Blue Origin, frankly, has struggled when it compares to SpaceX. They haven't flown anybody to orbit. They haven't flown a rocket to orbit. So that rivalry continues, and now there are only more entrants coming in. And so, I mean, okay, and I'll end with this, and then we can go to questions. If you look out 10 years, you know, where will we be? Are we going to have, you know, I think Elon would say, oh, we'll have humans on Mars. I don't think so. We're not going to have humans on Mars in 10 years. But you know, it's possible that we have humans on the moon again. And we not just have humans on the moon, but we have a base on the moon. And we have a space station around the moon within 10 years. It's possible that in 10 years, we have one, maybe two commercial space stations, commercial habitats. It's possible, too, that the ranks of astronauts really begin to grow and proliferate, and you see many more people having that experience of going to space. One of the things that happened just last year that I think shows you where we are is a mission that SpaceX did called Inspiration 4. And there was, you know, another one of these. It wasn't someone I had heard of, but, you know, very wealthy entrepreneur named Jared Isaacman, founder of a company called Shift4 Payments. It's a credit card processing company, but he's a fighter pilot, and he goes out and says, we don't know what he paid. I'm sort of guesstimating it was $100 million, somewhere in there. And he pays SpaceX, and he says, you know, I want to ride to space on your capsule. And he basically, that's what he bought. He bought launch, and would take 4 people in the Dragon spacecraft, and they went in orbit around the Earth. But instead, he paid for everything, and instead of you know, having other passengers pay, he kind of gave the seats away. Gave the seat away to a cancer survivor who was working at St. Jude's Children's Hospital, and then, you know, sort of an entrepreneur, and then someone who was basically was a sweepstakes. And that was interesting. And there were these 4 strangers, right? They're not professional astronauts. They had never been to space before. And there wasn't anybody who had been there. There was no guide. There was no Sherpa. There was no former astronaut. It was just 4 private citizens in orbit for 3 days. And actually, SpaceX had built this dome at the top of the spacecraft so they could stick their heads out and get these views. And that's, I mean, to me, I think an extraordinary thing. It's, you know, incredibly expensive. It's not something, you know, any of us will probably get to do. But in some ways, that goes back to the early dreams of what NASA wanted with the space shuttle. And that was sort of dashed with Challenger. And I think now, if you're a kid, you know, and I watched Challenger blow up, I think now these kids are having these memories. Now I've seen that, which is, I think, pretty extraordinary. So let me pause there. I hope we have lots of questions because I'm eager to hear questions. I think there are microphones around.
If you have a question, put up your hand. We'll get a microphone too. Don't be shy.
Hi, I enjoyed the talk. I just had a quick question. With the increase in the number of companies or entities that are trying to send things into space or wanting to, have you seen any increased interest in the amount of, or in cleaning up the amount of space debris that is currently orbiting our planet?
Yeah, so actually I'm working on a story about this right now. I don't know if people have seen the movie Gravity, right? But there's a lot of junk in space. There are spent rocket stages, there are dead satellites, there have been collisions, and so that there are many more pieces of debris. You may have seen the news from a few months ago. Russia fired a missile that hit a dead satellite that, just sort of as a warning to the United States and others that, all those satellites you have up there for national security purposes, we can target them. And that created a lot of debris. Actually, the astronauts on the International Space Station actually kind of had to evacuate the space station and get into their spacecraft in case the space station got hit and they needed to come back down. So this is a huge issue. It's been an issue for a long, long time. And you're actually starting to see some baby steps toward there. Actually, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy just had 2 kind of town hall listening sessions. One was about, actually debris removal, and the other one's about mitigation, how to prevent debris. I'm interested in the removal. So there are several companies, Astroscale, ClearSpace, that are developing the technologies to go out and remove pieces of debris. There's like either with this giant like claw or kind of like a magnet. And Astroscale, I think it's Astroscale, has this really cool animation on their website, because it's not just like, oh, it's a hunk of thing just floating along, you just go grab it. No, it's tumbling. Like, how do you catch it? And it's not. So the spacecraft actually, studies it and matches its tumble and then grabs it. But one of the things you heard was, there's not a business case to go clean up space. You need a government program to be able to do that. Or what they're saying is they combine those technologies, which gets to another really interesting, actually I'm really glad you asked this question, a new technology that's going on in space, and that's in-orbit servicing or in-orbit refueling. So, it used to be you had these massive satellites that are up in space, cost hundreds of millions of dollars. They would be up there for 20 years because they cost so much. Now they're much smaller. You can have satellites the size of a loaf of bread. The technology is cheaper. We had computers that were big mainframes, and now you have something the size of your iPhone. That computing technology has revolutionized space, but you can go up and service it. You can reprogram it, refuel it, something breaks, maybe you fix it. So they're trying, and they do think there's a commercial market for that. So they're trying to sort of build that technology where they do the servicing and the refueling to extend the life of a satellite. Or they say, well, instead of just extending the life of it, this one's dead, why don't we just remove it? Of course, there is, too, some real national security implications for that, right? There have been some Russian spacecraft that were getting maybe a little bit too close to some of our spacecraft. So I think that's a technology maybe the Defense Department would be interested in as well. But it's a huge problem. And the Pentagon has a program called Orbital Prime that they are working on right now that would be a tech demonstration to remove some of that debris. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Malachi. I'm an MBA student here. We talk a lot about the logistics of, like Jeff and Elon working on the logistics of getting to space. When I think about life in space, I think a lot about like what happens when you're there. And I'm curious, and your answer might be more about where I can find more information versus the actual information, but who is doing the work to think about like food creation, whether it's growth or just the sustainability of that for human life to be like, to work in space?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? Because I'm guilty of this. We spend a lot of time focusing on the billionaires and their rockets, but not like what they're launching or what that next generation looks like. So, yeah, I mean, if you go up on the space station, they've worked on growing food. Some of the astronauts were at least recently tweeting about the peppers they had grown. They've grown some really spicy peppers in space. The other thing that I think is really interesting too is in space manufacturing and 3D printing in space, right? Because you don't want to, getting out of Earth, think of it as like you're at the bottom of a well and you've got to get out of Earth's gravity well to get to space. And it's really, really hard to break free of Earth's gravity. So you don't want to haul all that stuff with you. If you can make it in space, and that's really interesting. And there are a lot of companies that are working on, there's a company called Made in Space that is talking about 3D printing objects in space. There's a company actually called Relativity Space that is 3D printing its rocket on Earth. And everyone looks at them as sort of a rocket company, but I think you could look at them and say, no, they're not a rocket company. They're a 3D printing manufacturing company. And if you, for example, can build a rocket on the moon and you've got water and you use that as your propellant, that's how you get further. But I think for now, NASA is doing a lot of that, and it's a really hard problem. I mean, if you're going to live on Mars, so much cargo and supplies and all of that has to be pre-positioned to keep human life. I mean, Mars, you get to Mars and Mars is just trying to kill you. A friend of mine said, like, if you have the perfect mission and the first humans have finally made it to Mars, oh my gosh, what an accomplishment. It's like, and if everything went perfectly, then it's like they're only in crisis mode, right? Because that's how dangerous it is. There's a couple, maybe Professor Neil.
Been talking a lot about rockets and space launch system you touched on, but it's all throwaway. And seeing some of the plans for NASA to go to the moon and onto Mars, they need an awful lot of SLS launches. It seems to be PowerPoint rather than actually doing something because the budget won't sustain that. So in your dealings with NASA and especially SLS and Boeing, is there any talk about making this reusable, or is it just build and throw away the Apollo way?
It's built and throw away the Apollo way. So SLS is the big rocket that NASA is building, the one that's going to be rolled out. It's billions of dollars over schedule, years behind budget. In some ways, you hear about wasteful spending at the Pentagon. This is, people have called the F-35 of space. It's called the Space Launch System. A lot of people deride it. Its critics deride it as the Senate launch system because it's being built in key Senate districts, that this is a job program more than really something that's going to help humanity explore. It's incredibly big and powerful. It would be more powerful than the Saturn V, but it's incredibly expensive. And there's some estimates that it's going to cost $2 billion to launch and then to be thrown away. And this isn't relying on new technology. In fact, the engines, the RS-25 engines on the main core stage are left over from the space shuttle. They're reusing that technology. These are shuttle engines. And in fact, the engines, I believe, on the first SLS mission that could launch this year and put that Orion spacecraft in orbit around the moon flew on previous shuttle missions. So yes, this is something that we've talked a lot about, particularly when there are other rockets now coming on the market to compete with that. So if you're NASA and you have a limited budget and you're looking at a rocket that costs $2 billion to launch, and Elon over here is building Starship that's fully reusable, the booster will fly back to the launch pad if this goes right. And the launch pad actually has these like chopsticks, these arms that will come in and catch it. The spacecraft is also reusable. The second stage would also come back. So that could be a lot less expensive. And as I was explaining the Artemis missions, right, SLS launches Orion. Orion goes in orbit around the moon, but it can't land on the moon. So Starship goes, meets up with Orion, and brings it back down to the surface. The astronauts get around, they get back in Starship. Starship flies them to Orion, they get in Orion and come home. So a lot of people are saying, well, why not just fly Starship and fly them right to the surface of the moon? Well, that's a good question. Why not do that? That seems simpler, that seems more reliable, and that's cost effective. But SLS has now been in development for a decade more. Billions of dollars have been spent. So when this has come up particularly with the former NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, and he said that if there were cheaper alternatives, he would consider those. And so maybe SLS goes away if Starship can do it. I think that is a possibility. There will be a fight. That's more of a political fight than it is an exploration fight, because there are going to be key constituents of that rocket that want to keep it going. Anyone else? I saw a few hands up there, a couple over here.
Hello, my name is Saj and I'm an MBA student. You're talking about the propulsion system, and I'm really interested to see how you picture so we haven't seen any disruptive technology in terms of the actual propulsion system that we're using, and how would you picture the next 10 years? When are we gonna see a complete change in how we boost the rockets going up?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's a lot of talk about using nuclear energy to do that. I think that's one of the next big phases that you're going to see, particularly when you get into space, because if you're already in space, you don't need as much thrust, because you don't have that big gravity well. This is not completely on to your point, but I'll tell it because it's an interesting story. When I was actually interviewing Jeff Bezos for the book, the way Blue Origin started was to try to answer your question. Is this the best way to launch rockets to space, to use a chemically fueled rocket? Are there other forms, other ways we should be looking at? And so for about 2 years, it operated as like a think tank, and it had just a few people. Neil Stephenson was there, the science fiction author. And so Jeff says to me, he goes, so do you want to hear about some of our crazy ideas? Because we had some really crazy ones. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, okay, do you know how a bullwhip works? I was like, what? He's like, no, a bullwhip. Actually, with your arm in the bullwhip, you can break the sound barrier, right? Conservation of momentum, mass times velocity. The mass of the bullwhip decreases toward the tip, so the velocity increases. So it's like, you're going to bullwhip people into space, Jeff? And he's like, no, not people, but maybe a satellite. And he was like, no, it was never going to work. But Neil Stephenson actually put that technology into one of his books, Seven Eves, about doing that, slingshotting something off the moon. So yes, I think there's a lot, but that's, I think, one of the next big areas for disruption. There was somebody else over here.
All right. Thank you for your talk. Really appreciate it. So my question is about private industries and companies. With their innovations in these recent years, they've been working with NASA to do all their projects. But do you think these private industries will no longer need NASA for their future jobs? And do you think they'll actually overtake NASA when it comes to exploration? This is far in the future, but
no, this is you're getting it right at the heart of it. Like, okay, when does this become a self-sustaining space economy? Because right now, SpaceX needs NASA. SpaceX needs the government. That's why SpaceX sued. They sued because they needed the money. They need that. When SpaceX won its first NASA contract, Elon changed his login, like his computer login, to I love NASA. Right? There is no SpaceX without NASA, without the government. They are propping up this industry, right? And without NASA, without the Pentagon, it goes away. So when can they stand on their own? Great question. Will it ever be able to stand on its own? Maybe not. Maybe it's just too difficult. But if you're building this sort of ecosystem where there are commercial habitats, there are other countries that want to go, there are institutions, there are scientists, there are businesses that want to do research, they're very wealthy people, the cost comes down, satellite technology increases, in-space manufacturing becomes viable, resource extraction, and there is a market, right, to go mine an asteroid that will pay real dividends, and you can make a business case for it, then maybe. We are not there yet by any means, but it's but a lot of really smart people, much smarter than me, think that that's where this is headed. Maybe one more?
Hi, thanks. You talked about Jeff and Elon taking on the military-industrial complex. Have you talked to them about their views or fears about becoming part of sort of the military-industrial complex, and particularly on the military side?
Yeah, and that's happened. I mean, particularly SpaceX, they were sort of the new kid on the block. The sort of small startup disruptor, no longer, right? They've got 7,000 employees, a lot of revenue. They are the big player. They launch national security satellites. They are the big provider for NASA. So I think the question is, maybe implicit in the question, so how do you do that but maintain that sort of innovative, driving hard mentality that allowed SpaceX to become a success now that instead of becoming fat and happy and complacent? I think a lot of that comes from Elon himself. I mean, he's a little bit crazy. I mean, he is just driving hard. He mouthed off on Twitter, but not too long ago, that he wasn't happy with the development of the Raptor engine for Starship, and people don't realize how far behind they are, and SpaceX could go bankrupt. And I don't think that was a legitimate concern, at least not yet. But he was lighting a fire under his people, and he'll fire people. He is a hard charger. That's the other thing. I mean, think about it. What happens to SpaceX if Elon dies or Jeff goes away? What happens to Blue Origin? Is it healthy? I mean, can they continue to exist? What will happen to this emerging space economy if those leaders go away? I think that's a concern. I mean, is it getting to the point, to your question earlier about, are we establishing a sustainable space economy, or is it too dependent not just on these private companies but on these individuals too? And is that one of the many concerns we have about moving from a national-only space program to one that is really dependent on the private sector as well? Because that creates all sorts of concerns. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a real treat. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.